The plate is empty. The last bite of dinner went down a few minutes ago, and the chair is comfortable. This is the part of the evening that feels earned, and the impulse is to stay exactly where you are. But inside the small intestine, a process has already started that does not wait for the body to feel ready. The carbohydrate in that meal, the rice, the bread, the potato, the piece of fruit, is being broken into glucose and pushed across the gut wall into the bloodstream. Within 15 minutes, the level of sugar carried in the blood begins to climb. Within 45, it reaches its highest point of the entire day. Eating started a clock, and the clock is already running. For a healthy adult, that peak can land somewhere between 140 and 180 milligrams per deciliter, depending on the meal. The blood is now carrying more fuel than it was built to hold in suspension for long, and that fuel has to go somewhere. Remotion counter from 90 to 160 label. Blood glucose, mg/dL after dinner, accent color, FFB 100. And here is the part that feels wrong. The muscles, the largest place that glucose can go, the tissue that should be pulling it out of the blood like a sponge, are doing almost none of that work. A muscle sitting still in a chair takes in glucose slowly. The fuel arrives, and the door it should pour through is mostly shut. The glucose has nowhere good to go, so it stays in the blood, and the peak climbs. So the question is not whether the sugar goes up. It always goes up after a meal. The question is how high the peak climbs, how long it stays there, and what decides that. The answer turns out to be one of the cleanest pieces of physics in the whole body, and it has almost nothing to do with willpower, and almost everything to do with whether the legs are moving. Hook to next block. The thing that opens that shut door is not a hormone arriving from somewhere else. It is the muscle moving. To see why a short walk after a meal does so much, it helps to look at how glucose actually gets out of the blood and into a muscle cell. It does not simply leak in. The wall of a muscle cell is mostly closed to sugar. Glucose is a fairly large molecule, and it cannot drift through the membrane on its own. It has to be carried across, and the thing that carries it is a protein called GLUT4. Think of GLUT4 as a set of doors built into the wall of the cell. When the doors are tucked away inside the cell, out of position, glucose stays in the blood. When the doors move to the surface and open, glucose pours in. So the whole question of how fast the blood clears a meal comes down to a smaller question. What decides how many of those doors are at the surface, open, at the moment the glucose arrives? And it turns out there are two separate ways to move them, two separate signals, and they work independently of each other. The first is the one most people have heard of. After a meal, the pancreas senses the rising glucose and releases insulin. Insulin travels in the blood, reaches the muscle, and sends the signal that tells the cell to bring GLUT4 to the wall. This is the normal route, and in a healthy body it works well. The cost is that it depends entirely on two things being intact. Insulin has to be released in the right amount, and the muscle has to still be listening to insulin clearly. If either of those weakens, the door stays shut longer, and the peak runs higher. The second route is the interesting one, because it does not need insulin at all. When a muscle contracts, the contraction itself triggers GLUT4 to move to the surface. The mechanical act of the fiber shortening and lengthening, repeated, sets off an internal signal inside the cell, carried in large part by an energy sensor called AMPK. When a muscle works, it burns fuel, the energy charge inside the cell drops. AMPK notices, and one of the things it does in response is bring the glucose doors to the surface to refill the tank. The muscle does not wait to be told by a hormone. The work is the instruction. This is the heart of it. A muscle at rest is a closed door. A muscle contracting is a door swinging open, independent of insulin, pulling glucose out of the blood directly. Walk after a meal, and thousands of muscle fibers in the legs begin contracting again and again, step after step, and each contraction is quietly recruiting glucose out of the bloodstream and into the tissue that can actually burn it. The walk is not burning off the meal through sheer effort, it is opening doors. This is not a new or fragile idea. The insulin-independent pathway for glucose uptake during muscle contraction has been described in the muscle physiology literature for decades, in review work by researchers such as R. A. Cater and Hargreaves. It is settled physiology, not a recent claim. What changed more recently is that someone bothered to measure how small a dose of movement it actually takes to matter at the dinner table. In 2022, Buffy and colleagues published a review in the journal Sports Medicine looking specifically at light walking after eating. They gathered the studies that compared sitting after a meal against short bouts of easy walking, and the pattern across them was consistent. Even brief walks, on the order of 2 to 5 minutes, taken soon after a meal, lowered the rise in blood sugar compared to staying seated. Standing alone helped a little. Walking helped more. Remotion, bar chart. Items, label, sitting, value, 100 DA. Label, standing, value, 82. Label, light walk, value, 63. Accent color, FFB 100. A fair word about the evidence, because the honest version matters here. Many of these studies are small, run over short windows, often in younger or healthy participants, and they measure the glucose curve over a single day, rather than long-term outcomes like heart disease. So the precise size of the effect for any one older person is not nailed down, and anyone who claims an exact percentage for every body is overstating it. What is solid is the direction and the mechanism. Contracting muscle takes up glucose without waiting for insulin, and a body that walks after eating shows a lower, flatter post-meal curve than the same body sitting still. So the most important factor in how high the blood sugar climbs after dinner is not only what is on the plate, it is whether the muscles move while the meal is being absorbed. The fuel arrives the same way either way. What differs is whether there is an open door waiting for it. The cause of the high peak is not the absence of insulin, it is the absence of motion. Hook to next block, and motion after a meal used to be the default condition of the human body, not the exception. Consider what the body expects to happen after eating and compare it with what actually happens in a modern evening. The gap between the two is not a matter of taste, it is a measurable difference in what the muscles are doing during the most important hour of the meal. For almost all of human history, a meal was the end of effort and the start of more effort. Food had to be gathered, hunted, carried, prepared over a fire and shared, and afterward there was rarely a soft chair waiting. People stood, walked, tended, cleaned, carried things, moved to another place. The meal was absorbed by a body that was upright and in motion. The post-meal glucose rise was met, automatically, by contracting muscle, by legs that were already walking for reasons that had nothing to do with blood sugar. Nobody planned it. Nobody knew the word glucose. The environment simply made movement the default condition and stillness the rare exception, and the body's machinery was tuned to that arrangement. The modern evening inverts that completely. The meal arrives already prepared, often eaten quickly. It is eaten sitting down. And the moment it is finished, the body moves from one seated position, the dining chair, to another, the sofa, where it will stay for the rest of the evening in front of a screen. The single window when the muscles could be pulling glucose out of the blood most usefully. The 30 to 90 minutes after a meal is the exact window the modern environment fills with sitting. The design of the evening points the body away from movement at precisely the time movement would do the most. This is not a moral failing, and it is not laziness. It is a mismatch between a body shaped by one set of conditions and an environment built for a different goal, which is comfort. The chair is a good piece of engineering. It is designed to remove load from the legs and the spine so the body can rest. That is exactly what makes it pleasant after a long day. But removing load from the legs is the same thing, physically, as keeping the contraction-driven doors shut. The chair is not neutral during the absorption window, it is actively holding the second route closed at the moment glucose needs it open. Look at the two scenarios side by side as physics rather than preference. In the first, the meal is absorbed into a moving body. Glucose meets thousands of open doors, the peak is blunted, the fuel is pulled into working muscle, and the curve comes down quickly. In the second, the meal is absorbed into a still body. Glucose meets mostly closed doors, the peak climbs higher, and it lingers because the only route left open is the insulin route, working alone. And the insulin route, working alone, is slower and more easily strained than the two routes working together, which is how the body was meant to run. The difference between those two evenings is not measured in effort or in sweat. The walk in question is light. It is not training. not a workout, not anything that would leave a person breathing hard. It is simply the muscle doing, for 10 minutes, the ordinary background thing it was always doing across the whole of human history, until a chair was placed in the way and the doing became optional. The chair provides comfort. The walk provides instruction, hook to next block. And the cost of choosing comfort over instruction is small at 30, and it stops being small somewhere after 50. There is a reason this matters more with each passing decade, and it comes down to two slow changes that run quietly underneath ordinary life, neither of which announces itself. The first is muscle. Starting somewhere in the 40s and accelerating after 50, the body loses muscle mass if nothing is done to hold on to it, on the order of a few percent per decade. This loss has a name, sarcopenia, but the name matters less than the consequence. Muscle is the single largest place glucose can be stored and burned. It is the reservoir. Less muscle means a smaller reservoir, which means the same dinner raises blood sugar higher than it used to, for the simple reason that there is less tissue standing by to absorb it. The meal did not change. The container did. The second change is the listening itself. The muscle that remains tends to become less responsive to insulin over the years, a gradual drift toward what is called insulin resistance. The insulin route, the first of the two doors, begins to stick. The pancreas compensates by releasing more insulin to get the same result, working harder for the same effect, and over time that extra effort wears on it. A peak that the body once cleared easily now takes longer to bring down. Put those two changes together and the picture is clear. After 50, there is less muscle to take up glucose, and the insulin-driven route into the muscle that remains works less smoothly. The post-meal peak climbs higher and stays longer than it did at 30, on the identical dinner, eaten in the identical chair. And there is a further turn of the screw worth naming. The two changes feed each other. Higher peaks and more circulating insulin push the muscle further toward resistance, and a muscle drifting toward resistance clears the next meal less well, which raises the next peak again. Left alone, it is a slow loop that tightens year over year, and most of the people inside it have been told only that this is what getting older feels like. Remotion, call-out, text. After 50, less muscle, stickier insulin route. The same meal makes a higher, longer peak. Icon, info. This is exactly where the second door earns its place. The contraction route, the one that does not need insulin, is precisely the route that is still available when the insulin route is faltering. A muscle that has grown half-deaf to insulin will still open its doors when it contracts, because that signal travels by a completely different path, the AMPK path, which does not depend on insulin being heard. So the very intervention that helps a 30-year-old a little helps a 60-year-old more, because it does not lean on the part of the system that is wearing out. It goes around it. The route that age weakens is not the route the walk uses. And the stakes are not abstract. A post-meal peak that climbs high and lingers day after day, year after year, is not a single harmless event. Each high peak is a stretch of hours during which the blood vessels are exposed to more sugar than they handle well. And that exposure, repeated thousands of times, is part of what stresses the lining of the vessels over a lifetime. Each high peak is also one more push, meal by meal, toward the deeper insulin resistance that sits underneath so much of what gets quietly filed away as ordinary aging. Hook to next block, which is why the smallest version of the fix is worth knowing exactly, down to the timing. So what is the actual thing to do, and when, and how much? The whole protocol fits in 3 numbers, and the most important of the 3 is the timing. The action is a short, easy walk after eating. Not a workout, not fast. The pace is the pace of walking across a parking lot or around the block while talking with someone. The kind of walking that does not raise the breath or break a sweat. Light intensity is enough, and this is worth sitting with because the instinct is to assume that harder is better. Here it is not. The goal is not to burn the meal off through effort. The goal is only to keep the leg muscles gently contracting while the glucose is arriving, so that the contraction-driven doors stay open all through the climb. A slow walk does that just as surely as a brisk one. The timing is the part that does most of the work, and it is the part most people get wrong by accident, usually by waiting too long. The glucose from a meal starts rising within about 15 minutes and reaches its peak somewhere around 45 to 60 minutes after eating. That window, the first half hour to hour after the meal, is when the blood sugar is climbing toward its high point. A walk taken inside that window meets the rising glucose with open doors and blunts the peak as it forms. A walk taken 3 hours later, after the peak has come and gone, still has value for other reasons, but it has largely missed the moment for this particular job. The instruction is simple. Start moving within 15 to 30 minutes of finishing the meal, while the curve is still on its way up. Do not wait until the body feels like it. The dose is small, smaller than most people expect. The studies that show a clear effect use bouts as short as 2 to 5 minutes. 10 minutes is a comfortable, generous version of that, with room to spare. And 10 minutes is easy to repeat every evening, which matters more than length, because the effect is per meal. The walk does not bank a benefit for next week. It blunts the peak of the meal it follows, and tomorrow's dinner is a new event with its own peak that needs its own walk. So this is a small daily action attached to a daily meal, not a weekly session to be scheduled and dreaded. The largest dinner of the day is the natural one to attach it to. A few practical translations, because the comments on videos like this always ask whether one thing can stand in for another, and the answer follows straight from the mechanism. The mechanism is muscle contraction during the absorption window. Anything that supplies that contraction counts. A walk is the obvious form and the easiest, but climbing a flight of stairs a few times, pacing the hallway while on a phone call, doing slow standing calf raises at the kitchen counter while the dishes soak, light housework done on the feet rather than seated, all of these put the leg muscles through repeated contraction at the right time, and all of them open the same doors. The single thing that does not count is the one thing the body most wants to do after dinner, which is to sit down and be still. For anyone with a joint that complains, a balance that is no longer certain, or a recent surgery, the walk can be slower, shorter, or done holding onto a counter or a rail, and it still works, because the requirement is contraction, not speed and not distance. The doors do not care how fast the legs move. They care that the legs move at all. This is also the place to be honest about the limits of what a walk can do. A walk after dinner is not a treatment for diabetes, and it does not replace anything a physician has prescribed. For anyone managing blood sugar with medication, changing the daily pattern of movement can change how that medication behaves. So that is a conversation to have with the doctor, not a decision to make alone from a video. What does the timeline look like for someone who simply starts tonight? The first effect is immediate and same day. On the very first evening, the walk taken inside the window lowers the peak of that one meal compared to sitting through it. There is nothing to wait for and nothing to build up. The mechanism fires on the first contraction of the first walk. Remotion, counter, from 160 to 120, label, post-meal peak with verse without the walk, accent color, FFB 100. Over days and weeks, the picture is gentler and harder to feel directly, which is worth saying plainly, so nobody expects a dramatic change they will not get. Repeated lower peaks mean the blood vessels and the pancreas are handling less stress at the end of each day. For anyone tracking blood sugar with a fingerstick meter or a continuous sensor, the after-dinner numbers tend to read lower and flatter than they did before. Over months, the muscle that is used regularly tends to listen to insulin a little better than muscle that is not, which slowly improves the route that had been sticking. None of this is dramatic on any single day. It is the quiet accumulation of many blunted peaks instead of many sharp ones, which is exactly the kind of change that matters over a decade and is invisible over a week. Hook to next block. The point is not the 10 minutes. The point is what the 10 minutes tells the body. Step back from the dinner and the chair and the curve and look at the shape of the whole thing. The body did not evolve to read a calendar or a clock. It reads signals. The rise of glucose after a meal is a signal, and the contraction of a muscle is a signal. And the body was built on the quiet assumption that the two would arrive together because for almost all of its history, they always did. Eating and moving were the same event, separated by minutes at most. The machinery that pulls glucose out of the blood through a contracting muscle is not a trick or a hack or a modern discovery. It is the original design, working exactly as intended the moment the two signals are allowed to meet. What the modern evening does is split those two signals apart. It lets the meal arrive without the movement and leaves the body holding a peak it was never meant to hold alone. The walk after dinner does nothing clever and nothing new. It simply puts the two signals back together, inside the same window, in the order the body has always expected them to come. That is why such a small action does so much. It is not adding something foreign to the body or forcing it into anything. It is restoring a pairing the body is still waiting for, patiently, every single evening, whether or not anyone shows up to provide it. And the same logic runs underneath a great deal of what goes quiet after 50. A capacity that looks lost to age is often a capacity that has simply stopped receiving its signal. Balance, grip, clarity, the ease of rising from the floor, each of these has machinery that is mostly intact and mostly idle, waiting for the mechanical signal that the modern day has quietly removed. The signal can be returned. Usually it costs minutes, not money, and the body answers faster than its age would ever suggest it could. The walk after dinner is only the clearest example of a rule that runs through the whole body. Give the system back the input it was designed around, and it does the rest on its own. The body does not flatten the curve on its own. It flattens the curve in response to a muscle that moves while the meal is being absorbed.